morning of February 9th, 2002 began like any other vacation day should. Soft sunlight stretched across the water of Port Canaveral, Florida, turning the Atlantic into a sheet of gold. Seagulls drifted lazily overhead as passengers gathered along the terminal dock, laughing, hugging, snapping photos before boarding the MV Atlantic Empress, a mid-sized luxury cruise ship preparing to depart on a 7-day Caribbean voyage. Among them stood Richard and Elaine Parker. Richard was 64, tall, deliberate in his movements, dressed in a pressed linen shirt and dark sunglasses that hid eyes sharpened by decades in business. Elaine, 60, held her wide-brimmed straw hat with one hand, her other resting lightly against her husband's arm as the ocean breeze teased loose strands of her hair. They looked like people who had earned this moment. Richard had built a regional chain of car dealerships across Central Florida, starting with a single used lot outside Orlando. Elaine had spent more than 30 years teaching English literature at a public high school, shaping generations of students who would later remember her as the teacher who never gave up on them. This cruise was meant to be their reward, a celebration of retirement, of freedom, of finally slowing down. They boarded at 9:20 a.m. Their cabin was Deck 8, Suite 8234, a corner stateroom with a private balcony overlooking the ship's wake. The Atlantic Empress carried just under 500 passengers, mostly retirees, a few families, a handful of newlyweds. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud. It promised elegance, calm, and personal service. Everything felt planned. Everything felt safe. The first 3 days passed quietly. Richard and Elaine attended a wine tasting, took a beginner's dance class, and shared dinner at the captain's table. Other passengers would later describe them as polite but reserved. They smiled often, spoke kindly, but never lingered too long in conversation. Always together, always attentive to one another. On the evening of February 11th, the Atlantic Empress docked briefly in Cozumel, Mexico. The Parkers disembarked for a few hours, wandered through a local market, and returned to the ship just before sunset. A crew member later recalled seeing them walking arm in arm toward the elevators, carrying a small shopping bag. That was the last confirmed sighting. The following morning, February 12, 2002, the Atlantic Empress was scheduled to arrive in Grand Cayman, but when the ship docked, Richard and Elaine Parker were nowhere to be found. At first, no one noticed. Their cabin steward knocked twice that morning. No answer. He assumed they had left early for a shore excursion. It wasn't until the evening muster, when all passengers were required to check in, that their absence triggered concern. Security unlocked Suite 8234. The bed hadn't been slept in. Elaine's reading glasses were folded neatly on the nightstand. Richard's wristwatch, an expensive gold Omega he never removed, rested beside the bathroom sink. Their passports remained locked inside the cabin's safe. The balcony door was closed, unlocked, but untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no scuff marks. It was as if the room itself had been paused in time, everything present except the people who belonged there. The ship's captain, Jonathan Hale, initiated a full passenger sweep. Security footage from the hallway cameras showed Richard and Elaine entering their cabin at 7:46 p.m. the previous evening. They never emerged. No one else appeared at the door. No interruptions, no disturbances. At 8:17 p.m., Captain Hale contacted the U.S. Coast Guard. By midnight, search and rescue helicopters were combing the waters between Cozumel and Grand Cayman. Crew members retraced every corridor, stairwell, and public space. Passengers were interviewed one by one. Nothing surfaced. The ocean remained silent. Richard and Elaine Parker had vanished without a trace. Back in Orlando, their daughter Emily Parker received the call at 2:03 a.m. She answered groggy, confused, still still half asleep until the words "missing passengers" landed like a blow to the chest. She sat on the edge of her bed as the cruise line representative spoke in careful, rehearsed tones. Her parents were missing. The ship was being held for investigation. Search efforts were underway. Emily caught the first flight to Miami. When she stepped into Suite 8234 later that afternoon, she felt it instantly. The wrongness. Her mother's toiletries were arranged neatly on the counter. Her father's shoes were aligned by the closet. The shopping bag from Cozumel sat unopened on a chair. Everything was in place, except her parents. Emily spoke with investigators, with crew members, with passengers. She posted online. She contacted local news stations, but as days turned into weeks, the story faded. The cruise line released a brief statement expressing condolences and offering a settlement. The Coast Guard ended its active search after 72 hours. The official conclusion was phrased carefully. No evidence of foul play. Presumed accidental fall at sea. Emily didn't believe it. Her parents weren't reckless, they weren't careless, and they certainly weren't suicidal. They would never have left that room without their glasses, without their watch, without each other. Something had happened. Something unseen. And as the Atlantic continued to roll on, keeping its secrets beneath endless waves, Emily Parker made a promise she didn't yet understand would consume the next 6 years of her life. She would find out what happened, no matter how long it took. Before diving into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. Because what happened aboard the Atlantic Empress was not an accident. And the ocean, no matter how vast, never keeps the truth forever. Emily Parker refused to let her parents become a footnote. In the weeks following Richard and Elaine Parker's disappearance, the quiet streets of their Orlando neighborhood felt unnaturally hollow. Neighbors left casseroles on Emily's porch. Former students of her mother mailed handwritten letters describing the way Elaine Parker had changed their lives, how she stayed late after school, how she believed in kids everyone else had written off. A candlelight vigil was held at the community center on February 20th, 2002. More than 200 people attended. Emily stood at the front of the room, staring at a framed photograph of her parents taken years earlier. Richard in a navy blazer, Elaine leaning into him, smiling softly. She thanked everyone for coming, her voice steady, but she couldn't bring herself to say the word memorial. Memorial meant final. She wasn't ready for that. Local news stations covered the story briefly. Florida couple missing at sea, the headlines read. Helicopter footage showed the Atlantic Empress docked in Miami, the Coast Guard circling overhead. Then, as always, the cameras moved on. By March, the calls stopped. The reporters stopped asking questions. The world kept turning. Emily didn't. She took a leave of absence from her job as a financial analyst and devoted herself completely to finding answers. She contacted maritime attorneys, private investigators, journalists who specialized in cruise ship incidents. Most gave her the same response. Without witnesses, without evidence, without a body, there was nothing to pursue. But Emily kept digging. She requested the full passenger manifest and began calling names one by one. Most passengers barely remembered her parents. A few recalled seeing them at dinner, always together, always polite. Then one call stood out. A retired nurse from Ohio hesitated before speaking. She told Emily she'd seen Elaine Parker on the morning of February 11th, standing alone near the ship's library. Elaine had looked shaken, her eyes red, as if she'd been crying. When the woman asked if she was okay, Elaine smiled quickly and said she was fine. That wasn't like her. Emily knew her mother. Elaine Parker didn't cry in public. She handled problems quietly, privately. Something had upset her. Emily contacted the cruise line and asked if her mother had reported an incident, an argument, anything unusual. The response came back days later. There were no records of any incidents involving the Parkers. All interactions were routine. The answer felt rehearsed. And then, in late March, Emily received a call that changed everything. The man on the line introduced himself as Daniel Reyes, a former security officer aboard the Atlantic Empress. His voice was low, tense, as if he were afraid someone might be listening. "I didn't know if I should call," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about your parents." Emily's heart began to race. He told her he'd been on duty the night they disappeared. Around 10:30 p.m., he heard raised voices in the hallway near Suite 8234. By the time he arrived, the corridor was empty. He knocked on the Parkers' door. No answer. The next morning, he was told the couple had gone overboard. Accident. Case closed. "And you believed that?" Emily asked. There was a pause. "No," said Daniel quietly. "I was told to forget what I heard." Emily drove to Corpus Christi, Texas to meet him in person. Daniel was in his early 30s, thin, restless, constantly glancing over his shoulder. Sitting across from her in a small diner, he admitted something he'd never told anyone else. The voices he'd heard didn't sound like a couple arguing. One voice was male, deep, unfamiliar. The other was quieter, pleading. He thought it might have been Elaine. Emily felt her chest tighten. "Why didn't you report it?" she asked. Daniel stared down at his coffee. "Because I needed the job, and because 2 weeks later, another crew member fell overboard. They called that an accident too." After that, he kept quiet. For the first time since her parents vanished, Emily had something solid, a witness, a timeline, proof that the official story didn't tell the whole truth. And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, Daniel Reyes disappeared. He stopped answering calls. When Emily returned to Corpus Christi weeks later, his apartment was empty. A neighbor said he'd moved out overnight. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. By 2004, she'd drained most of her savings on legal fees and private investigators. Her leave from work had turned into unemployment. Friends urged her to move on. A therapist gently suggested that her search might be preventing her from grieving. But Emily couldn't grieve, not without answers. She launched a website, findtheparkers.org, posting photos, timelines, and a plea for information. She shared it on travel forums, maritime safety boards, anywhere someone might have seen something. Most posts were ignored. Some attracted conspiracy theorists. Emily ignored them all. She wanted facts. Years passed. Emily returned to work, took a lower-paying job, tried to rebuild a life that felt permanently suspended. Every February 12th, she lit 2 candles and sat in silence. Then, in the summer of 2008, the ocean finally spoke. His name was Lucas Bennett, a recreational diver from Key West. On July 14th, while diving near a coral shelf locals called the Garden Drop, Lucas spotted something wedged between 2 formations. A small waterproof pouch, faded and covered in algae. Inside was a Florida driver's license. The name read Richard Parker. Lucas searched online and found the case. He found Emily's website. He called her immediately. Emily flew to Florida the next morning. They met at a dockside cafe. Lucas handed her the pouch. Her father's face stared back at her, faded but unmistakable. Then, Lucas showed her something else. Scratched into the inside lining of the pouch were 3 words, "Not an accident." Emily's hands trembled. For 6 years, she'd been told her parents' disappearance was a tragic mishap, but her father had left a message, a final one, and it changed everything. Emily Parker stared at the scratched words again and again. Not an accident. Her father had written them knowing he might not survive, knowing someone would eventually find them. That realization settled into her bones. Within days, Emily assembled a small team. Lucas Bennett agreed to help. Through diving contacts, he introduced her to 2 technical divers and a marine forensics consultant from the University of Miami, Dr. Karen Liu. They returned to the site where the pouch had been found. For 3 days, they searched the reef methodically, fighting shifting currents in limited visibility. On the third afternoon, 75 feet below the surface, one of the divers signaled frantically. Wedged beneath a coral overhang was a rusted steel suitcase. They brought it to the surface. Inside were clothes, toiletries in a leather-bound notebook swollen with seawater. Emily recognized it immediately. Her mother's handwriting. Dr. Liu transported the notebook to her lab, working carefully to separate the fused pages and digitally enhance the ink. Most entries were mundane, shore excursion notes, reminders, small observations. But the final pages told a different story. February 10th. Past crew storage on deck 3. Door open. Saw something we shouldn't have. Richard is writing his own note. At the bottom, 3 names were underlined twice. Carlos Rivas, Victor Malenko, Sean Burke. And one sentence. They know we saw them. Emily went straight to the FBI.
The same agent who dismissed her years earlier, Special Agent Thomas Keene, sat across from her as she laid everything on the table. "This isn't fear," she said. "This is documentation." Keene studied the evidence in silence. 3 weeks later, he called her back. "We found one of them." Carlos Rivas was working at a car wash outside Tampa. When confronted, he broke. He admitted he'd been ordered to block off a storage room on deck 3. Inside were duffel bags filled with cash. When the Parkers saw it, they became a problem. Rivas said his supervisor, Sean Burke, handled problems like that. The FBI tracked Victor Malenko to Brooklyn. He tried to run. He failed. Burke was found months later in Mississippi, managing a coastal warehouse. He confessed to making one call the night the Parkers disappeared. "I didn't do it myself," he said. "I called someone who specializes in making problems disappear." The name he gave was Fabian Morelli. Former military, freelance fixer, no permanent address, and the man who boarded the Atlantic Empress the night Richard and Elaine Parker were killed. Morelli was arrested at the U.S.-Mexico border in August 2009. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimony, the notebook, the pouch. Fabian Morelli never showed emotion as the verdict was read. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Life without parole. Outside the courthouse, Emily finally allowed herself to cry. Justice had come, but it had taken 7 years. In the years that followed, Emily founded Voices Lost at Sea, advocating for families whose loved ones vanished aboard cruise ships. New laws were passed, surveillance became mandatory, crimes had to be reported within hours. Her parents' story changed maritime safety forever. Years later, when investigators developed film from a recovered waterproof camera, one image showed a man in a crew uniform with a scar along his jaw. Fabian Morelli, captured by Richard Parker moments before his death. Emily framed the photo of her parents smiling on deck, the ocean behind them endless. They hadn't disappeared, they had left a trail, and because of that, the truth rose. The ocean keeps its secrets, but never forever. Please subscribe to the channel to join us in exploring other cold cases across America. Thank you for following the Fabian Morelli case.
The arrest of Fabian Morelli sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom. For Emily Parker, it should have felt like relief. The man responsible for her parents' deaths was finally behind bars. The truth, long denied, buried, dismissed, had been dragged into the light. But justice, Emily would learn, never arrives quietly. Within days of Morelli's indictment, the media descended. National networks replayed images of the Atlantic Empress. Headlines spoke of a floating crime corridor and a murder hidden in international waters. Commentators debated how many other disappearances might not have been accidents at all. Emily stood at the center of it, exhausted and wary. She held a press conference outside the federal courthouse in Orlando. Cameras clicked as she read from a single page, her hands trembling just slightly. For 7 years, I was told my parents' deaths were an accident. I was told to stop asking questions, but I never stopped, and now we know why. Richard and Elaine Parker were murdered because they witnessed a crime, and I will not stop until everyone responsible is held accountable. She stepped away without taking questions. 3 nights later, Emily returned to her apartment after work and noticed something wrong immediately. Her front door was ajar. She froze in the hallway, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at her not to go inside. She called the police and waited, back pressed against the wall, listening to the distant hum of traffic and her own uneven breathing. Inside, the apartment had been ransacked. Drawers pulled open, files scattered, closets emptied onto the floor. Nothing valuable was missing. They weren't stealing. They were searching. Special Agent Thomas Keene arrived within the hour. He surveyed the damage slowly, his jaw tight. They wanted to see what you have, what evidence, what connections. Emily swallowed hard. I keep everything backed up, encrypted. They won't find anything. Keene nodded grimly. That's not the point. This was a message. Emily moved into a hotel that night under FBI advisement. She varied her routine, checked her car for trackers, avoided posting her location anywhere online. The truth had made her a target. Meanwhile, the investigation widened. Financial crimes units traced payments linked to Sean Burke and Fabian Morelli through a web of shell corporations registered in the Caribbean. What they uncovered was staggering. The Atlantic Empress hadn't been an isolated operation. At least 6 other cruise ships had been used between the late 1990s and early 2000s to move illicit cash, drug money, weapons profits, bribes, hidden among supplies and passenger luggage. The constant movement between jurisdictions made detection nearly impossible. The ships weren't just vacations. They were pipelines. Morelli had been the enforcer, the final solution when intimidation failed, and Richard and Elaine Parker had crossed his path by accident. Or so it seemed. Then another revelation surfaced. A former captain of the Atlantic Empress, Leonard Varner, was dying in a nursing home in Pensacola, Florida. His sister contacted the FBI, saying her brother wanted to confess something before it was too late. Emily insisted on coming. Varner lay in a narrow bed, oxygen hissing softly, his skin gray and drawn, but his eyes were clear, haunted. I knew things were wrong on my ship. Cargo that wasn't logged, men who weren't on any manifest. He coughed violently, then continued. The night your parents disappeared, Sean Burke came to my cabin. He said a situation was being handled. I didn't ask questions. I should have. Varner's voice cracked. A man boarded the ship that night from a supply tender. Tall, quiet, scar along his jaw. He went straight to Deck 8. Fabian Morelli.
20 minutes later, Burke returned alone. I signed the accident report the next morning, Varner whispered. I told myself I had no proof, but I knew. And I've lived with that guilt every day. 3 days later, Leonard Varner died. His recorded confession became a cornerstone of the case. Fabian Morelli's trial began in March 2010. The courtroom was packed. Families of other missing cruise passengers filled the benches, watching closely, hoping this case might finally force the system to reckon with what it had ignored for decades. Emily sat in the front row every day. Morelli looked ordinary, middle-aged, graying, the kind of man who blended into crowds, the kind of man who survived by never being remembered. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece: the cash operation, witness testimony, Nancy Parker's notebook, the scratched message inside the waterproof pouch. Not an accident. The defense argued coincidence, circumstantial evidence, unreliable witnesses. But the jury wasn't persuaded. After 3 days of deliberation, The verdict came back guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Life without parole. Emily didn't cry in the courtroom. She sat still, hands clasped, absorbing the words she'd waited nearly a decade to hear. Outside, reporters asked how she felt. "Justice," she said simply, "and exhaustion." But even as one chapter closed, another was already beginning. Because Emily Parker wasn't done yet.
The conviction of Fabian Morelli should have been the end. For Emily Parker, it was only the beginning of something else. In the months following the trial, letters began arriving from across the country. Handwritten envelopes, long emails, messages from people who had lost someone on a cruise ship under circumstances that never quite made sense. A woman in Oregon whose sister vanished in 1999. A man in South Florida whose parents disappeared during a Caribbean cruise in 2003. A college student whose father went missing during a repositioning voyage and was written off as likely overboard. Different ships, different years, the same ending. No bodies, no answers, no accountability. Emily read every message. She responded to every one. What she saw was a pattern. Families silenced by legal jargon, brushed aside by corporations protected by international law, told again and again that the ocean was unpredictable, that accidents happened, that nothing more could be done. She knew that lie too well. In June of 2010, Emily founded a non-profit organization called Voices Lost at Sea. Its mission was simple, but radical: to advocate for families of missing cruise ship passengers, to pressure cruise lines and lawmakers for transparency, and to ensure disappearances were treated as potential crimes, not inconveniences. She rented a small office in downtown Orlando, 1 desk, 1 filing cabinet, 1 assistant working part-time. But word spread quickly. Families called daily, some angry, some grieving, some desperate just to be heard. Emily guided them through records requests. She helped them file reports. She connected them with attorneys and journalists who would listen. She turned her parents' tragedy into purpose. In 2010, Emily testified before Congress during hearings on maritime safety. Sitting beneath harsh lights, facing lawmakers who had never set foot on a cruise ship's crew deck, she told Richard and Elaine Parker's story from the beginning. She described the untouched cabin, the missing footage, the scratched words inside the waterproof pouch. An accident, she said, her voice steady, does not leave messages. Months later, the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act was expanded. Surveillance requirements increased. Crime reporting timelines shortened. Jurisdictional cooperation with the FBI strengthened. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Agent Thomas Keene retired from the FBI in 2012. On his last day, he visited Emily's office. "You changed the system," he told her. "That doesn't happen often." "I didn't," Emily replied. "My parents did. I just refused to let their voices disappear." Every year on February 12th, Emily returned to Port Canaveral. She stood near the dock where her parents had boarded the Atlantic Empress, watching ships depart, new passengers waving, laughing, unaware of what the ocean could take. She didn't feel anger anymore, just resolve. In 2014, investigators contacted Emily with unexpected news. Among the items recovered from the underwater suitcase years earlier was a disposable waterproof camera. At the time, it was assumed the film inside was destroyed. New forensic techniques suggested otherwise. Would she consent to having it developed? Emily said yes. Of the 24 exposures on the roll, only 6 were salvageable. Most were ordinary vacation photos, Elaine smiling on deck, Richard leaning against the railing, the ocean stretching endlessly behind them. Then came the final 2 images, The first showed the interior of a storage room, steel crates, duffel bags, stacks of cash partially visible through unzipped seams. Proof. The second image was grainy but unmistakable. A man in a crew uniform standing in a hallway, his face turned just enough for the camera to catch the scar running along his jaw. Fabian Morelli, captured by Richard Parker hours before he was killed. Emily stared at the photo for a long time. Her father had known. He'd understood the danger and still documented it anyway. Not as a hero, as a father, as someone who believed truth mattered. Emily framed the photograph of her parents, the one where they stood together on deck, smiling, and placed it at her desk at Voices Lost at Sea. Whenever a case stalled, whenever the weight of grief pressed in, she looked at that photo and remembered why she kept going. Time did not erase the loss, but it reshaped it. By 2017, Voices Lost at Sea had become more than a nonprofit. It was a lifeline. Families who once felt isolated now had advocates, legal guidance, and, most importantly, someone who believed them. Emily Parker had become that person. She spoke at conferences, she wrote editorials, she appeared on news programs when another disappearance made headlines. She learned maritime law not in classrooms, but in courtrooms, through filings, depositions, and the quiet agony of families waiting for answers. Every case carried echoes of her own. That February, on the 15th anniversary of her parents' disappearance, Emily organized a memorial at the same Orlando Community Center where the first vigil had been held all those years earlier. More than 300 people attended. Former students of Elaine Parker stood beside employees who once worked for Richard Parker. Investigators, advocates, and families helped by Voices Lost at Sea filled the room. Behind the building, a small garden had been prepared. At its center stood a bronze sculpture, two hands clasped together, rising from a stone base engraved with names. Richard Parker, Elaine Parker. Emily stepped forward without notes. "My parents were ordinary people," she said. "They lived quiet lives. They worked hard. They helped others. They didn't look for trouble." Her voice steadied. "But when they saw something wrong, they didn't turn away. And for that, they paid the highest price." She took a breath. "For years, I was angry. Angry at the people who killed them. Angry at the systems that failed them. Angry at a world that could let good people disappear without asking questions." She took a breath. "But I'm not angry anymore, because their story didn't end in silence. It changed laws. It helped families. It proved that even when justice is delayed, it's still possible." She placed 2 white roses at the base of the sculpture. Others followed. That night, Emily returned home and opened a box she had kept sealed for years. Inside were the items recovered from her parents' cabin: her mother's reading glasses, the unopened shopping bag from Cozumel, her father's watch. The watch had stopped at 11:47 p.m. on February 11th, the moment it meant seawater. Emily wound it gently. To her surprise, it started ticking again. She strapped it to her wrist and listened to the steady rhythm, a heartbeat, a reminder that time moved forward, that survival was possible. Standing in her window, looking out at the Orlando skyline, Emily thought about the long road that had brought her here, the dead ends, the doubts, the moments when giving up would have been easier. She thought about Lucas Bennett finding that pouch in the reef, about her mother's notebook, about a father who left a message knowing his daughter would never stop searching. The ocean had taken her parents, but it hadn't defeated them, because truth, once found, cannot be buried again. Somewhere out there, other families were still searching, other voices were still waiting to be heard. And because of Richard and Elaine Parker, they now had a better chance. Emily closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet room, "I found the truth. You can rest now." And perhaps, beneath waves stretching endlessly toward the horizon, they knew. Because love remembers, love persists, and love, when tested by time and silence, still brings the truth home. Please subscribe to the channel to join us in exploring other cold cases across America. Thank you for following the Fabian Morelli case.